Hey everyone, welcome to the next tutorial in the series of Java for Beginners. It's not exactly a tutorial, it's basically just a recap for all of these things that we've already learned, and hopefully it's going to get you looking at them sort of more confidently, or maybe in a different way if you think about it in a slightly different way than I originally taught it. So the first thing we'll go over is variables. I'm pretty sure you'll know how to do this, but we're going to go through everything in the list that I've stated. So first things first, variables. How do we declare a variable? Well, if I put a comment here, we simply first do it by the variable type, we then give it an identifier, and then optionally, we can assign a value to it. And we do this by first doing the variable type. There's many different variable types. We'll do integer, for example. We then give it an identifier, which is basically the name of the variable that we use to access that variable. I'm going to call it a, and we can end it right there. We can end it with a semicolon. Or optionally, we can assign a value to it, say equal to 10. Or alternatively, do the exact same thing as this. We can end the semicolon there, so we still have this variable a declared, and then we can access a later on. We don't need to add an int in front of it because stating int means that we're declaring it, but we've already declared it. So we can simply write a and then set it equal to whatever somewhere else. So that's pretty much it for variables. If all you need to remember out of this is that the equals is the assignment operator, and it assigns the value on the right hand side to the value on the left hand side. So now we can look more at mathematical operators. If I make an integer called a equal to 10 and an integer called b equal to 20, and then an integer called c equal to -1, we can pretty much make any variable. I'll make another one called d, and we can pretty much make any value of a variable by using mathematical equations. We can use the plus symbol, the minus symbol, times divide, which is the asterisk for times, and the / for divide, and we can make up any equation we want using brackets, and we can also use the modulus symbol, forgot about that. So we can make up any plethora of thing, like a times b times c plus a plus b minus c times b minus a, all modulus of c, and then put everything in brackets, times it by a, and you can see we can make any manner of equation. We can system.out.println that, put the value of d, and you can see whatever answer that may be. Apparently it's -1700, so I'll take Java's word for it. So that's how we can make mathematical equations. We simply use brackets and all of the different math symbols we can do. I'll quickly go over the modulus symbol again because that's the trickiest one. So if we have an integer called a equal to 10, or rather we'll make an integer called a here and we'll print it out, what the modulus does, it gives you the value of the remainder once you divide by something. So if I have a value of 100, and I say divide it, do the modulus of 2, it's going to divide 100 by 2, which equals 50, and there is no remainder because that's an exact division. And if we hit run, you'll see the answer is 0. If we made this equal to 3, 100 divided by 3 is 33.333, except because we're using integers, we don't go into decimals. The answer is 33 and then remainder 1, so it will give us a remainder of 1. So that's it for mathematical functions. We'll now take a look at strings. So what is a string? We can declare a string much like we do with any other variable. We first write string, but we must make sure string has a capital letter because it's actually an object and not a built-in Java variable type. We can then give the string an identifier, such as name, and we can set it equal to any value we want between speech marks, like so. We can't use individual speech marks because that's reserved for single characters only. There are many different built-in methods you can use for the string, since the string is an object. I'm not sure if we've been over those yet, but if you hit name and then put the full stop, you can see that there are loads of different variables we can use. For testing strings, we can test starts with, ends with, the size of it, many different things like that. We can also add strings together, like so. If I make a string called hello equal to hello, and then a string called world equal to world, and then I can make a string called hello world equal to hello plus world, it's simply going to concatenate those two strings together and it's going to make them one. So I'll print out the value of hello world, and you'll see that it adds the two strings together and simply prints them out. If we have variables such as numbers in a equals 10, int b equals a times 50, or 40, sorry, we can then add on any values we want. So if I say add b, it will add on the value of b. So whatever this is equal to, it will simply print it out as a string. We can add this up, and we can see it just prints out 400. So that's how we can build strings using the plus symbol. We'll now take a look at methods and functions. So first of all, what is a method and what is a method? Well, what a method does is, it is much like a variable. We give it an identifier, but we can also give it parameters and a return type. And what a method does for us is it executes a same block of code however many times we want by simply making one call to one thing. So we're going to make a new method now, and we're going to have to write the static keyword just because we want to use it inside of the main method, but we don't actually need to worry about what static means for now. All we need to know is that the static lets us use it inside of the main method here. So we can then give it a return type such as void because we don't want it to return anything, and we can call it print, for example. And then we want a system.out.println because that's quite a mouthful to type, and we want to give it a parameter. So we want to give it a string s, so it prints out whatever string we want. And then to use this method, we simply type in print, and it takes a string parameter, so we can write hello world, and then do that. So what this does is, writing print calls the method print here, and the parameter we give it, string, in this case becomes equal to this s here, and then it will execute the code using the value of s we passed in. So this is simply going to print out hello world to the screen, like so. And that's the basis of methods. We can change the void return type to an int, for example, and then we can return the value of two numbers added together. Say we passed in an int called a and an int called b, we can then return the value of a plus b, and that is basically a simple add method. And then we can say system.out.println, and we can say an integer called x is equal to add function, and then say 10, 20. And because the return type of this method is an integer, we can assign it to an integer because it's going to give us back the value of the two parameters we passed in added together. So we can hit run, and that's because we didn't print out anything. If we put x in there, you can see it prints out the value of 30, hopefully. Yeah, there we go. So that's basics of methods, and that's all we've learned about methods so far, just parameters and return types. So now we'll move in to Boolean logic. First of all, we'll learn about the Boolean variable. What is a Boolean? Well, we can declare one much like any other variable. We write the word Boolean, and then we can call it say test, for example, and a Boolean variable holds any value that is true or false. Quite simply, we can either give it a straight up true or a straight up false, or we can give it a logical test such as int a equals 10, int b equals 20, and we can say this Boolean variable is equal to a is greater than b. So a is not greater than b currently, so this test variable is equal to false. If we change this to 100, 100 is greater than 20, so this would be equal to true. And then we can use the if statements to test our variables. So for example, writing test, it tests the value of the variable we pass in. If it's true, it's going to execute the code here. If it's false, it's going to move out or move on to any else statements that we have. So for example, system.out.println, if it's true, if this test is true, a is greater than b, then we could say a is greater than b. And if not, if it goes to the else statement, we can then print out a is less than b. So running this should yield the result of true, and there we go, a is greater than b. If we wanted to add more than one, test, we, for example, test if they're equal to each other. We can add else if a is equal to b, for example, we can system.out.println and say a is equal to b. And in this case, let's make them equal just for argument's sake and hit run. you can see it says a is equal to b. That's because it first tests this test variable, and test is equal to a is greater than b. 100 is not greater than 100, it's equal to it. So this is false, so it'll move on to the next one. It's then going to test if a is equal to b, in which case it's true, so it's going to run this, and then it's going to skip the else statement because this has already been true, and then it will move on to the next one. So that's the basics of if statements. So now let's learn how we can control if statements more by using and or. And or are pretty simple concepts, but the tricky part is learning the order in which they're going to run. So we can have an integer called a equal to 100 and an integer called b equal to minus 100. We can then make a boolean variable called test again. We can say if a is greater than 0, and we'll call this test a. We can then make a boolean called test b. We can say if b is greater than 0. So we have now have two booleans. In a's case, test a is true because 100 is greater than 0. In test b's case, b is not minus 100 is not greater than 0, so b is false. We can then test for various different combinations of the two. So if I write, for example, I'll just write both are true. We can write, if we want to test both, we can test a, and we can use the and operand by doing two ampersand symbols. We can then say test b. Now for the and operand to return true, both conditions must be true. Condition 1 and condition 2 must be true. So in other words, the only way this is going to be true is if both conditions are true. If either one of them is false or both of them are false, it's going to return false. So I'm going to run this now, and you'll see nothing happens because it didn't enter this if statement. That's because test A is true, but test B is false. So if we only wanted to test if one of these was true, then we can use the OR instead, and that's done by two pipe symbols. And the pipe on my keyboard is done by doing shift and then the backslash. It may be different for other keyboards, I'm not entirely sure, you might have to Google it or something. But if we hit run now, you can see it prints out both are true. That's just because we didn't change this. But basically what it's doing is it's saying test A is greater than 0, B is not greater than 0, but it's saying A or B, A is true, B is false. Well, A is true, so it's going to continue on. And the one thing I would take away from this lesson is make sure that you use brackets correctly to test the various ones. Say you wanted another one, say we had and test C, I know you haven't created that yet. You want to make sure you place the brackets around the correct positions, just to make sure that you're testing the correct conditions, because otherwise you could yield unexpected results. So now we'll move on to loops. How do we loop our program? Well, the easiest way is to use a while loop. A while loop is going to iterate as long as the condition is true. So if we make a boolean called loop, and we'll make it equal to true first of all, and we can say whilst loop. So loop is equal to true. Now at the moment this while loop is infinite because loop will always be true. We don't change it anywhere else. So let's make an integer called x equal to 0, and now let's make a increment of x just at the top here. So we're going to increment x, then we're going to say if x is greater than or equal to 100, then we're going to say loop equals false. So what this is going to do is it's going to iterate this loop, and it's going to increment x by 1 each time, and we're actually going to print out the value of x just so we can see what's going on. And then outside here we'll do system.out.println, and we'll say loop has stopped. So basically what we're doing is we're looking at it in a slightly different way from last time. We're incrementing x each time. If x becomes greater than or equal to 100, we're going to set loop equal to false, which means it's no longer going to continue. So if we run this now, you'll see that it printed out the values of from 1 to 100, and I can't quite fit it on my screen. If I drag it down, it will. You can see that loop has stopped. It prints out after it reaches the value of 100. So I'm going to move this back down again. Alright, so that's how we use the while loop. Pretty much exactly the same is the do while loop, except for the order in which it does it. So the while loop tests the condition and then runs the loop, whereas the do while loop runs the loop and then tests the condition. So the do while loop looks like this. We write do, excuse me, and then we write while at the end. And we can say whilst x is greater than x is less than 10, and we'll make our int x equals 0 up here. So we'll make x equal to 100 first of all, and we'll just say system.out.println and the value of x. So 100 is not less than 10, so this is false, except the difference between the while loop and the do while loop is that this is going to run first of all, and then it's going to check to see if it's false. So it's going to print out the value of 100, it's then going to realize that x isn't less than 10, so that equals false, so it's not going to iterate again, it's just going to break out the loop. So this is simply going to print out 100, and there we go. So that's the do while loop and the while loop. So let's move on to arrays. First of all, what is an array? Well, we can picture it as the matchbox analogy that we initially thought of, except imagine there's loads of different matchboxes all stuck together, and this one mass of matchboxes has only one label to reference it by, although each of the individual matchboxes stuck together can still have their own values inside. It's basically one identifier but many values. We declare this by first doing the variable type of array we want to do, and we then do 2 square brackets, and we can read this as string array, like so. We then give it an identifier, say names, and there's 2 different ways we can initialize an array. We can either say equals and then do the spiked brackets like so, and then do a semicolon at the end, and we can then start doing comma separated values of different values that we want, and that is one way of doing it. But it's important to note that the only way you can do this is when you initialize it. You can't do it this method anywhere else. If you want to change the values later on, or I mean that method you can still change them later on. If you want to initialize them later on, we can say string array names is equal to a new string array, and then we can say give it a value of 2, so it holds 2 different names. And now the important thing to remember is that indexing starts at 0. So we don't access the first name and then the second name, we access the 0th one and then the first one. So we'll first access name 0 equals Ollie, and then names 1 equals Jason or Hassan, whatever. And then we'll say system, damn it, if I can spell, there you go, system.out.println, and then we can say print out the value of name 0 plus, and then we'll just add a comma, and then print out names 1, like so. And we'll print out, this just should print out the 2 names. And it's very important to remember about the 0 indexing, because if we mistake this for 1 and 2 rather than 0 and 1, we will see that we actually get an array index out of bounds exception. You can see array index out of bounds exception 2. We're trying to access technically the 3rd element in the array, but it doesn't actually exist yet. So that's an important thing to be wary of. So now let's look at for loops and enhanced for loops. For loops take 3 different parameters. It first takes a variable, initialization, it then takes a condition, and it then takes an increment / decrement. And the way that we program this is write for, and we then declare a variable inside of the parameter, such as int I equals 0. We're then going to say as long as I, and we're actually going to create another thing up here. We're going to say a string array called names equals, let's say, Ollie, Aiden, Jason, Joe. And we can then say as long as I is less than the names dot length, we're just going to access the built-in array variable called length, and that's going to return the length of the array. So names.length, we then do the increment or decrement. In this case, we're going to increment it, so we say I++, which adds 1 to the I. So now we can use the spiked brackets to create a block, and at each iteration, we're simply going to print out the value of the names at that point. So names and then I. So it's going to first print out the first one, then the second one, then the third one, until it reaches the value of the length. And you'll see that this prints out all values in the array. Now that was quite a convoluted way to do it in the array. The usefulness of that type of for loop is to loop through an array when you need to know the number that it's at. But if you only want to say print them out, then we can use an enhanced for loop. And we do this by writing for, and we then give the variable type that we want to represent, in this case string, I'll just call it f, We then put a colon and say what array we want to loop through. So let's say names. And we then create the block. Oops. Names, there we go. So the difference between this is going to iterate through every single element in names, except at each iteration, this s will become equal to the next one along. So let's quickly write system.out.println and then do s. So in the first iteration, s will be equal to Ollie, and it's going to print it out. The next iteration, s will be equal to Aiden, it's going to print it out, and so on. And you'll see that it does exactly the same thing. I'll hit run, and there you go. So that's how we use a for loop and an enhanced for loop. So now let's take a look at object-oriented programming. So I'm going to create a new class quickly, and I'll do the same one we did last time. I'll call it, actually let's do a different one. I'll call it dog. So our pet dog needs to have a name, and we'll say string name, and we'll say string owner, for example. And we want to make sure that the name and the owner is always entered. So we're going to make a constructor. We're going to say public dog, like this. And it's like a method. A constructor is a method that runs when we initialize the object. So we want to set the value of name and owner. So we're going to give it parameters. So we're going to say string name, string owner. So when the user makes a new dog object, they're going to have to enter in a string of a name and a string of the owner. So to initialize these two to those, we simply write this.name, and the this refers to this class, so it's accessing this one rather than that one, because I explained in previous tutorials that local variables will always take priority over global variables. So if we didn't have the this, I'll show you quickly what that does. If we write name equals name, like so, it's going to have an error. It's going to say assignment to itself. So that's because we're assigning this equal to itself. So we're going to put this dot name to access this one here equals name, which accesses this one here. And we'll do the same for owner equals owner. So now that we've made a constructor and two variables, let's go back and create three different dog objects. So dog, we'll call it max equals new dog, and we need to give it two parameters, and this is indicated by the string name and string owner. So the name of this dog is Max because we called the variable Max, and the owner is me, for example. We can then say a dog called Harry equals new dog, and we need to give it parameters for the constructor. So it's called Harry and it belongs to Hannah. And again, a constructor, this method here, a constructor is a method that runs when the object is initialized. So as soon as we call new dog, it's going to basically access the constructor. We're going to pass in those parameters there, and then it's going to set them equal to it, like I explained just earlier. So we can then make, although those two ones are fine, we can now system.out.println, and we can say print out the value of max.name, and I'm going to copy this down, max.owner, and then copy this down twice more, and then we can say harry.name, and then harry.owner. And the important thing to remember about objects is that this dog instance, this max instance of dog, has its own set of name and owner variables, and this Harry instance of dog has its own set of name and owner variables. So you'll see when I print it out, there we go, you'll see that it prints out Max and Ollie first of all from the first one, and then Harry and Hannah, and that's because they're separate objects, so they don't alter. Although we only declare these variables once, we can make as many instances of this as we want. So that is it for this recap. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Hopefully it was useful, because we have basically been over everything that I've been over previously. In the next tutorials, we're going to start looking at some built-in objects that Java has for us and how we can utilize them and use them. We're also going to be looking at graphical user interfaces and other awesome stuff like that. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and thanks for watching.